Thank you everyone for coming this morning. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome three colleagues who I personally use in my courses. They have stimulated my own thoughts and reflection on the Islamic traditions. So seeing them here on this panel and welcoming them to Smith is really a distinct pleasure for me, and I know for lots of my students, and I know as well that this is a great pride for the entire university. I'm gonna be very brief in my introduction so that I leave the floor for them to give their own presentations. Therefore, I'm gonna just introduce them for you. I know that you probably could look at the program. First, from my right is Professor Amina Wadood, who's an emeritus professor from Virginia Commonwealth University, and since she left, she has been very much involved, largely as an activist, but also as a pioneer in inspiring lots of ideas of change. She's a leading figure of the Musawa movement. Thank you for coming, Professor Wadood. It's a great pleasure. Actually, Wednesday we had a fantastic meeting with her, and the discussion that she had with Professor Ali yesterday afternoon was first rate. Professor Kesha Ali from Boston University. She is now becoming one of the leaders of the field of Islamic studies, especially as this field is starting to shape itself. For a long period of time, it was one of the, what you call it, a footnote or a side interest, especially broadly in the American academia, and more it's becoming to be its own field, setting the tone of research on its own agenda rather than as a corollary to other fields. Directly next to me, Professor Sadia Yaqub from Williams College, who's a rising star in medieval Islamic studies, especially in relation to the role and the way we can study the contribution of women to the tradition. So each one will speak up approximately 20 minutes, and then we are going to have an open discussion. So please, as you listen, prepare and prep your ideas for questions and conversation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin, as always, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I actually should take this opportunity to thank my host here. I've been here at Smith the whole week, starting with the warning of the storm that was coming up and then the closure of all institutions on my first day. And everyone rose to the occasion, and we managed to actually fulfill much of what had been on the agenda. I love people who are flexible like that. So, and I especially want to thank Jane, because she's been very sensitive to my constantly reminding people what the weather is like in California, picking me up and dropping me off if I just don't want to figure out how to get anywhere on my own. So, you know, thank you especially. And Professor Suleiman, by the way, I guess everybody here locally knows that this guy can really cook. I elected to talk about, in particular, how the Muslim women's movement is leading all reform efforts in Islam today. And actually, I was invited to do I was invited to do any topic I wanted at the University of Melbourne in December, and this is what I decided that I would talk about. So I pulled together a proper paper, knowing that I had 40 minutes. And I could not finish everything in that 40 minutes. So I decided that for 20 minutes, it's not going to help for me to try to get through all of it. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm just going to say briefly what the three parts were. And then I'm going to actually start at the end, because that's where I got shortchanged when I was trying to, be proper with my time in Melbourne. I have to say a little bit about what I mean on the topic of reform in Islam and Islamic thought. And then I have to say something in particular about the Muslim women's movement, and particularly the burgeoning of the understanding of such a thing as Islamic feminism, which is in fact a kind of a new understanding, and how that came about. And then, in particular, I want to talk about Musawa, which has been mentioned here. And since I got shortchanged and couldn't talk about Musawa as much as I liked to keep to my time, I'm going to do it backwards, and I'm going to actually start with a quotation from the Musawa's website, and then I'm going to go backwards in that way because I think it will help me to keep all three of these topics in some type of order with the priorities that I see for them and myself, okay? Musawa is a knowledge-building movement promoting equality in the Muslim family. Musawa provides advocates and academics access to existing knowledge and creates new knowledge about women's rights in Islam. We seek to apply feminist and rights-based lenses in understanding and searching for equality and justice within Muslim legal traditions. Such lenses help reveal the tension between the egalitarian and hierarchical voices in the tradition and uncovers women's voices that were so long silenced in the production of religious knowledge so that their concerns and interests can be reflected. We believe that the production and sharing of knowledge should be participatory, should recognize non-traditional forms of expertise, and should begin with context rather than text. In this way, the knowledge produced will be grounded in the lived realities of women and men. These realities that inform the approaches to the issues and the questions being asked. In my estimation, Islam has continually been going through reform. Often the reform is mandated by external circumstances, some of which we are familiar with, but in particular, with the effects of colonialism, the physical and geographical colonialism, I think the Muslim reform movement became a lot more self-conscious in terms of what it was doing. And actually, in most circles, it is accepted that the reform is not only necessary, but also beneficial. There are a few places where they pretend that there is such a thing as a sort of an epistemological distinction between reform and renovation and some other kinds of breakdowns, but I think that that's just, sort of, I think that's sort of hair splitting. And so we want to look at reform actually as the way in which one both simultaneously honors what has preceded us by way of knowledge and experience of Muslims, but is very much grounded in how do we maintain the principles and the values in a trajectory that fully embraces whatever is the current scenario. So the current scenario when the creation of the nation state came about was not necessarily so well fitted, but that is the fate of the world. We are now in that reality. And as a consequence, adjustments have been made, and whether or not these adjustments are self-conscious, that is, whether or not we're actually looking at what is the construction of the reform and what are the methodologies, what are the objectives, whether or not we're actually looking at it or we're just trying to survive, which is a very real component also of reform, because sometimes, as I said, the mandate comes externally. In the context that we are in now, when we talk about reform, there are certain issues that come to the forefront. For example, the reality of the nation state and what does that mean, but also within the context of post-colonialism, what is the idea of secularism and how does this impact on our understanding of our own history and also of our present and where we want to go in the future. And there is not a singular understanding, so it is a conscientious part of the reform discourse. Another aspect of it, which I've been putting a lot of attention to in the last 10 years or so, are notions of authority. It's very interesting because religious-based traditions and systems of thought, more or less all conclude in the matter of some type of sacred authority. And because of the existence of this as a fundamental basis of its self-understanding, eventually the notions of how that authority gets adjudicated in real context begins to be displaced by a form of authority of its own. Unfortunately, in the context of Islam, Muslim peoples, Islamic history, and Islamic thought, authority was so squarely located in the male body. that the ways in which you even start to articulate ideas of equality and justice for women were all easily reduced to something that was antithetical to Islam itself. Obviously, that's a big problem. But the way to address the problem, in my estimation, is a deconstruction of these kinds of hegemonic notions of authority. So I've been working on what I call the democratization of authority, and Musawa operates out of that basis, and I guess I could say that it is both something that inspires me, but also is something that I inspire to continue to see made manifest. How do we democratically decide upon matters given the context of some of the global realities? Another issue, obviously, that's at the forefront of the reform discourse today is the relationship between the spectrum of Islamic locality, from very conservative, even violent conservatism, to different kinds of radical progressivism. Maybe I should do that right to left. Put the progressives on the left, my left. Even understanding even understanding this perspective of diversity and trying to incorporate it under a single umbrella that is what we might call Islam, is a very contentious matter, but it is a matter that is very indicative of just the nature of how reform discourse and methodology is concluded. Obviously, the relationship between the understanding, which I'm beginning to see more clearly is an erroneous understanding, but is really quite globalized, of Islam as a legal system, which is in fact an idea which is almost part and parcel with the colonialist movement. Before that time, it wasn't necessarily part of the self-identification of Islam and of Muslim intellectuals. And instead, I hope that everybody knows that at the time when Europe was going through its dark ages, Islam and Islamic thought was going through one of its highest intellectual levels in all fields, and in fact contributed to the transference of certain knowledge like medicine and philosophy and theology to other parts of the world as Europe came out of its dark ages and then became, a violent aggressor, taking over the lands and cultures of other peoples and making certain expectations amongst those peoples. The existence of the structures of the state and of governance is not uniform across the Muslim world. We have still monarchies, and we have often different forms of democracies and republics operating with a constitution, which is strategically very important for what happens in the women's movement, which I will hopefully I will get back to. For me, the reality of participating in and now being seen in some circles as one of the craftswomen of Islamic gender reform, I keep saying this, and I hope it really makes sense. I had no idea about all this stuff when I came in, so I wasn't saying, let me be a path maker and, let people refer to me on things. It was the furthest thing from my mind, and sometimes I'm a little bit overwhelmed by what it means now, because I can't pretend that that's not the case. But for me, I was always trying to understand what is the relationship between the very notion of our humanity and the very location as a believer of a relationship to the divine, to the creator, to the sacred, and how is that put into operation in different kinds of systems? And what are the elements, what are the pieces that go together in order to make this? And this is how, Allah just sort of gently nurtured my life and, put me at different places in the world. And in 1995, at the Beijing Global Conference for Women, I was there actually as a participant with the Malaysian group that I helped to form, which is Sisters in Islam. And we were just so naive. It was just like a global conference, and we're going to talk about our work, and that's all. And the first thing that we encountered were two very aggressive voices that basically dominated everything, not only that happened there, but for the next 10 years. And that's why they're strategically very important now when I think about the Muslim women's movement. And again, I'm not going to give the nuance, but you can ask me, because this literally is a whole paper in and of itself. But one voice was particularly formed by Muslim women who were themselves secular feminists. And I want to say secular feminists here because they were categorically against the use of Islam or any religion and the discourses about what would be women's rights, what would be our contribution to and our approaches with the CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and what would be our source texts of inspiration, and what would be the basis of our even analyzing what were the lived realities. And that voice was very strong because it was the voice that was most clearly understood by the architects of the international instruments and by other international funders and human rights bodies and women's rights bodies and the like. They simply understood that. It just made sense to them. At that time, in the 1980s, the rise of what we call political Islam, or the Islamist voice, was already a reality. And that reality impacted women and men because it said there is only one authentic way to be Muslim in the world today, and that is that you must defer always to something called Islam. So both of these sides agreed that you cannot have both Islam and human rights, or Islam and feminism. You can't have both of them. They agreed, and as a consequence, they shaped what would happen in the next 10 years. But the reality was that most of us were someplace else. We actually wanted women's full equality and justice, and we wanted Islam. But we had to establish a coherent methodology about how to present it and even how to distinguish ourselves from the dominant voices that were on the table. Those of us who continued to have some alliance with Islam, all of the secular feminists could just say, well, we're just Islamists and we're part of that whole genre. And because we criticized the patriarchal dominance of the articulation of the traditions, the Islamists said that we were secular feminists. And so there we were, and there we were for 10 years. And in the pressure cooker that came between those, we began to nurture the seeds of our own autonomy. And in that autonomy, we decided that the whole idea that there must be a conflict between human rights and Islam were both subsets of a construction of what it means to be a feminist and what it means to be a Muslim. And when we took agency for defining not only Islam, but also feminism, in the end we could articulate another kind of location, and that location was much more dynamic. And because of the kind of dynamism that has had to go with being able to first construct this, but also to be able to put it into application, the reality of such a thing as Islamic feminism came about. Because before 2009 and the launching of Musawa, I categorically refused the term feminism. So I haven't even been a feminist for 10 years. And the only way that I could be a feminist was to understand that every epistemology and every system has been the construction of human beings themselves. And when I take agency to make my own constructions in concert with other people, and also located within what we said here, the lived realities of Muslim women globally, then it is possible for me to say, I don't want that Islam. I don't want a patriarchal, hegemonic, authoritative Islam, and that's actually okay. So one of the main things that happens in Reform Islam is an articulation of who gets to control even the very nature of how we understand the system of Islam, how it gets to be applied, what is its relationship to law, the law of the land, international law, and the law of demand, because sometimes it's demand itself that makes a difference. So, for example, in Egypt, they were categorically opposed to any form of birth control under some understanding of Islam, and then when they start to experience such a rapid, rate of reproductions that they realized that they would not have the resources to be able to support those people. Guess what? They came up with a more nuanced articulation of what they mean by reproduction, and it's so interesting to have witnessed these kinds of things because, again, sometimes the demand is external, sometimes the demand is internal. The internal demand is what interests me the most. I have only 5 minutes, so let me just, kind of say how this leads into the establishment of Musawa and what we do. The internal demand is what's very interesting to me, and that is that, I think as I said at some point along this week, because Muslims feel under siege, and it's a very real siege, we are characterized globally as if we exist only in one form, and that form is not even represented by a fraction of a single percentage of our 1.6 billion population, and that is violent extremism. That is the face of Islam globally. We know something different, and yet and still, policies that are being made, resources that are being allocated, and agendas that are being set are all facing that. You can get more money for counter-extremism than you can for reproductive rights. reproductive health. So this is the reality that we're in. And yet, there is another faction that I think is important, and that is the extent to which within Islam and Islamic discourse, we are able to nurture and to accept the wide variety of diversity that exists within us. We all like to say it in kind of a lip service, that Muslim women are not a monolith, and then we go back and we still try to subsume her under certain, sort of singular characteristics. To engage with radical pluralism is one of the opportunities that I think working with Musawa has really, in a way, it's sort of lightened the load, because I believed in it philosophically, but I didn't know necessarily how to articulate it or how to really deal with it in the ways in which it was manifest. But I really learned, because Musawa is not about a whole hegemonic power dynamic. First of all, it's not an organization, so it's difficult for people sometimes to understand. You have to have a secretariat in order to be able to, help to organize its operations and to keep its liaisons. But it is literally diffused between, at the moment we have over 30 countries that are working coherently to be able to support, sort of the basic ideas. And in each of the places where we work, we accept that the setting of the agenda can only come from that place. You can't determine for a set of people what is their major needs. You have to be able to listen to them, understand the work that they're doing, and the constraints that they have in order to be able to achieve that work, and help to provide for them means and resources to be able to collectively develop strategies in order to be able to combat it and in order to be able to achieve real change amongst their constituency. And why I say this is leading in the reform, well, first of all, there's no aspect of Islamic reform that is not gender inclusive. Even if the discussions and the all-male panels and all that continue to go on, there is no issue that simply affects just men. There is, however, this reality of Muslim personal status law or Muslim family law that countries still continue to believe is essential to even their national agendas. And there's so many unexamined aspects of this that is allowed to continue, because anybody can just say, you can't do that, that's against Islam, and then everybody, including, the United Nations, will throw their hands up and say, what can we do? That's their religion, So for us, taking agency with the definition of Islam and with how it is adjudicated has meant, first of all, familiarizing ourselves with the entire trajectory of Islamic discourses over time, but also taking agency to help to shape that conversation and to put that conversation about what is Islam into practice with regard to individual nation states and their constitutions, and globally in how those nation states relate to international bodies. So we bring in all these three dynamics all at one time, producing new knowledge in Islam, challenging the notions of equal citizenship within any particular nation state, and also advocating at the international level for a much more inclusive understanding of what is Islam, rather than one that defers singularly to the articulations of the sort of patriarchal male dominance. Thank you very much.
My remarks will focus on Muslim women in the American Academy over the last few decades, outlining very briefly what I perceive as three key areas of research. Scholar activists working in Muslim women's studies operate within a shifting set of constraints and possibilities. That first phrase, scholar activists, comes from Gisela Webb's edited volume, Windows of Faith, Muslim Women Scholar Activists in North America, and my co-panelist named and explored the nascent subfield of Muslim women's studies in her book, Inside the Gender Jihad. Webb's anthology, published in 2000, brings together contributions from a dozen Muslim women of different backgrounds, writing on topics from early Muslim narratives to modern Pakistani rape laws, to Quran interpretation, to education and birth control. Wadud's book from 2006 gives a single author's braided accounts of academia, activism, and scriptural interpretation, a kind of merging of memoir and manifesto. And together, these two volumes explain the importance of Muslim women scholar activists and illuminate both the wide-ranging scope of the enterprise and its promise and perils. The American Academy, in which Smith is located, provides space for Muslim women to engage in serious scholarly investigation of the Muslim tradition and its practitioners across a range of times and places. You'll see that range even just here on this panel, from Musawa today to medieval Muslim women jurists. But those who investigate the Islamic textual tradition and early Muslim history in particular in ways that are typical of the Anglo-American Academy, with a focus on texts and a focus on historical documentation of what really happened, and I've sometimes done this, may face criticism from other Muslims, some located inside the academy, some out, for pursuing knowledge outside of what they perceive as traditional and legitimate paths. On the other hand, those engaged in constructive projects, so investigating Muslim history and tradition to retrieve and deploy usable egalitarian pasts, as I've also sometimes done, face criticism from other directions. Those who believe that religious studies must remain objective, those who prize philological rigor over and apart from all other qualifications, those who argue that constructive engagements with the vast Muslim tradition must occur in ways other than those we use. And that's to say nothing of hostile opposition from right-wing critics of the universities or the humanities, or explicitly anti-Muslim actors and organizations. These are, of course, legion. Although I've had a variety of kinds of criticism directed at me from a number of different directions, I've been buffered from its harshest effects, partly because of my privileged social and institutional locations. I'm white, I'm straight, I have tenure in an R1 institution, right? All of these things help. In Muslim women's studies, as elsewhere in and beyond the academy, Black women and women of color are simultaneously most vulnerable to vicious intersecting forms of harassment and least likely to have the institutional resources and support to weather the storms generated by unpopular or uncontroversial research. So in everything from the way the deans, provosts, and universities treat us to the way that Twitter exists as a space of engagement and criticism, the benefits and costs of engaging in public interactions on scholarly matters are not equally distributed. As to the content of the research and the public-facing conversation, here we come to what in the early 20th century was often talked about as the woman question in Islam. Ways of representing and speaking about Muslim women in the past and in the present are fraught and deeply political as well as politicized. What do I mean by political? I mean that they're enmeshed in and have impact on power relationships. So, example, Afghan women's activism under the Taliban, like the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, RAWA. By politicized, I mean actors invoking them in instrumental ways to serve political ends. Example, Laura Bush's invocation of Afghan women's sufferings to justify American invasion after 9/11. So women and gender nonconforming scholars who study Islam and Muslims, especially gender and sexuality among Islam and Muslims, confront and face challenges related to both who we are and what we study, and for what we study given who we are, right? Those two things can't always be separated. This holds true in our academic institutions, in our professional organizations, in our religious communities, and when engaging broader publics. The conversations that Webb and Wadud began about committed scholarship, identity politics, gender, and religious authority, or situated in particular around Muslim women in the North American Academy, because other elements of those conversations had been going on for quite some time, are even more relevant in this particular moment of heightened Islamophobia and the increasingly corporate university. Now, in addition to the unsympathetic critics that I noted above, Muslim women's studies in the Western Academy, American, European, and beyond, has also been rightly criticized by, among others, figures like Fatima Sidet and Vanessa Rivera de la Fuente for failing to engage or treating only as a primary source for their analysis the works of Muslim women writing in other languages and or living in the global South. In failing to engage these scholars and practitioners and thinkers on their own terms, academic feminists are replicating colonial power structures. And Western academics, in turn, may be willing, in numerous respects, find themselves constrained by peer review and tenure committees, which may consider these figures insufficiently rigorous or too activist to engage as scholars, as collaborators, or in other kinds of ways. American Muslim women's academic work on Islam is already suspect. And so there are often a series of unsatisfactory compromises, which are in no way unique to women or to Islamic studies or to religious studies as a discipline, but they're familiar to anyone working within and between different systems. Do you work from within? Do you work from outside? Are you situated at certain thresholds, which you sometimes step over with one foot and then you retreat? So the academy can serve simultaneously as a haven from and bulwark against patriarchal structures of authority within a minority religious community, but also as a place in which discriminatory structures hold sway. But what of scholarship that Muslim women scholar activists have produced in these paradoxical spaces? I want to suggest that since the 1980s, we've seen core concerns for justice, dignity, and equality. In here I'm thinking of figures like Rifat Hassan and Aziz al-Hibri, among others, played out through engagements with Quran and with law and increasingly with theology. And these disciplines, of course, overlap more in the work of some than others. They don't follow each other in a neat and tidy historical progression, but I would suggest that one can discern a general shift in emphasis from Quran to law, by which I mean, in part, jurisprudence, to theology over the years, and a shift from a focus on scriptural texts themselves to analyses ranging from quite critical to critical as well as deeply constructive of male-authored interpretations to still tentative engagements with Muslim women's experience as a source of knowledge. Yesterday, we heard a little bit about a tafsir of praxis and exegesis of praxis, and this is increasingly becoming a formal mode of engagement, as with Deborah Majid's recent use of what she calls Muslim womanism to talk about African-American Muslim women and polygyny. These sorts of different methods and modes apply in contexts as diverse as Ibn Arabi's mystical thought, to engagements with jurisprudence, to, of course, as I mentioned, polygyny, lived experiences, to also experiences of the scriptural text and reading the scriptural text as a woman, as folks have done. Now, for much of this period of 30 plus years, underlying each of these approaches, Muslim women scholar activists, whether embracing the term feminism or not, and differing on matters of basic strategy as well as orientation to the established interpretive tradition, generally have shared a basic view of the Muslim past. And this view helps justify and frame reform projects, helps to create the conditions in which governments, religious scholars, and other activists will be able to support specific pragmatic changes in Muslim women's legal rights and social norms surrounding women's participation in social institutions. And this narrative, in a very, very, very oversimplified form, goes something like this. First, God revealed the Quran. And if understood properly, the Quranic message is egalitarian and above all just. It was constrained in some ways due to its revelation in the patriarchal environment of 7th century Arabia, but even where the text seems to favor men, overall, the trajectory of the prophetic mission and divine revelation was liberatory for women. Next came the scholars. in what Leila Ahmed has talked about as the elaboration of the founding discourses of Islam, elite men who were embedded within and unable to see beyond the dominant patriarchal values of their era interpreted scripture and formulated law in ways that unduly subordinated women, including through the integration of sexist and misogynist hadith. They mistook, these elite scholars, their interpretations for God's will, imbuing their socially conditioned views with an aura of immutability and divinity. And so these processes must also be understood in relation to the compilation of the Hadith corpus and its incorporation into exegesis and law. Now, in this broad Muslim reformist understanding of the past, we get to the modern era, where we've arrived at a time where women engaged in projects for gender justice, along with other reformists, may ignore or reject the Hadith corpus and much of the intellectual tradition that draws on it and builds from it in favor of unmediated reinterpretation of the Quran. And the Quran, of course, is assumed, or at least publicly affirmed, by virtually all Muslims, no matter how otherwise reformist or progressive, to be verbatim divine speech, which is unlike, for those of you who come to this from comparative context, the way that most Jewish and Christian scholars treat the biblical text, which makes its interpretation, that is to say the Quran's interpretation, a central and essential element of a reformist religious project. Women thus affirm the need to engage as women with the authoritative book as a partial corrective to biased male interpretations and as the foundation for a more equitable jurisprudence and a more inclusive and just theology. This move to proceed directly to the text instead of engaging with generations of commentaries and the elaborate edifice of jurisprudence is not, and this I want to stress, uniquely feminist, but rather characteristically modern. As Aisha Hidayatullah pointed out in her study of North American Muslim women's Quran interpretation, these trends in women's interpretation, that is to go directly to the text, are representative of broader Muslim tendencies, which rely on vernacular languages and often bypass classical interpretive traditions. And even where the relevant scriptural canon encompasses the compendia of hadith or prophetic tradition alongside the Quran, the notion that everyone can read them, a kind of Muslim sola scriptura, is a characteristic gesture of Muslim revivalism as well as contemporary reform movements, which just goes to show that Muslim women are like other Muslim people. Go figure, right? Now, this work on scripture by people outside the ranks of the religious scholars, of the ulama, has been vital as a foundation for similar work on this second area in which gender justice advocates and scholars have concentrated their efforts, so from Quran to law. Muslim women worldwide, as you've just heard, live with a variety of legal systems that make claims to be Islamic. And Muslim women's engagement with Islamic law sometimes occurs as they advocate repeal or reform of existing national laws, or sometimes where there are movements toward imposing some version of Islamic law, the activism is towards holding that off, right? Staving off what's perceived as bad for women. So advocates for particular interpretations of law frequently and directly cite scripture and interpret it to support the views that they want to see, as well as selectively incorporating and upholding doctrines from the pre-modern legal tradition. I've written about this a fair amount. Now, in addition to writing that directly targets specific legal provisions of particular Muslim majority nations or activist campaigns that do the same, there is a modest but growing literature that deals with the classical legal tradition on its own terms. That is to say, critical and analytical, but not directly constructive, more about interrogation of the sources to understand them, which has implications, to be certain, for contemporary political projects, but isn't directly focused on them. Sadia Yaqub, whom we're lucky enough to have with us this morning, is one of the most promising of a new generation of scholars working on classical texts and those used by modern ulama. And sometimes this sort of scholarship seeks to reveal the basic cosmological norms and assumptions at play in legal texts and rulings, even if they go largely unarticulated. This is also a project of some of those like Aisha Chowdhury working on pre-modern commentaries on the Quran. For instance, the assumptions about male authority in the family and God's authority in the universe can intersect in interesting ways in legal texts as well as in scriptural commentaries. Very recently, some of these scholars, such as the South African scholar Fatma Sidat, whom I already mentioned, have begun to address not only particular legal rules, but also legal theory, critiquing the presuppositions and aims of the law or basic ideas about male and female legal personhood, which interestingly, she's shown, come to be defined in very separate ways in the modern era, right? So the consolidation of the idea of the Muslim woman as a particular kind of legal subject is also in part a product of colonialism and its backlash. Now, theology, or work that calls itself theology, has until fairly recently not had much of a place in the struggle for gender justice. And what I mean is that explicit engagement with theological discourses has been relatively rare among Muslim women scholars, even as key claims about God and human being and their interrelationships motivate and sustain their projects, from Quran and Woman at least. These have been core concerns. Theology in the form of kalam, dialectical theology or philosophical theology, has been much less prominent in Muslim women's thought than jurisprudence. But of course, jurisprudence has dealt extensively with many claims reasonably defined as theological. Who's in, who's out, how do human beings relate to God? But in the last several years, there's been a dramatic shift into the use of theology as a name for what some Muslim feminists are doing. So I'll conclude by mentioning a new volume on what's called Muslima theology, with American Muslim scholar Marcia Hermanson observing in her introduction to the volume, and here I quote her, "The field of Muslima theology is still developing in conversation with global activism for Muslim women's rights, new academic and institutional contexts for higher level studies of the Islamic tradition, and to an extent, more traditional institutions and discourses of Islamic learning," end quote. This variety of contexts and engagements with activist questions puts Muslima theology in parallel in some respects with liberation theology, as well as with womanist and mujerista theologies. And it builds on early work on the Quran. In this way, it represents not a departure from, but a continuation of the work that Muslim women scholar activists have been doing for decades. Thank you.
Thank you. So my talk today is going to take us back a few centuries into the 14th century. And what I want to do is focus on the life of a 14th century female jurist by the name of Fatima bint Abbas, or more popularly known as Fatima al-Baghdadiyya. Muslim women's religious authority and leadership has been quite a contested issue the past few decades, not only in American Muslim communities, but also around the world. Both Amina Wadud and Keisha Ali's talks have given us a rich picture of Muslim women scholars and activists who are shaping our understanding of Islam in the 21st century. Also the 20th century, also the 19th century. It's a long history. In the ongoing debates about Muslim women's religious authority, its legitimacy, its limits, etc., contentious claims are often made about the past, and particularly the role of Muslim women in Islamic history. In following these debates, I have noticed two main narrative trends. The first is what I characterized as a modernist triumphalist narrative of progress. This narrative is what we see most commonly in media coverage of any development in the realm of Muslim women's authority. It tends to make invisible Muslim women scholars in the past, tending to present the pre-modern past as oppressive for Muslim women and modernity as the opening of possibilities. It sets up a binary between tradition and modernity, interpreting contemporary developments in Muslim women's religious authority as an unshackling from the chains of tradition. The second approach, however, views the past as authoritative, often looking upon it nostalgically. In this approach, Islamic history is replete with Muslim women scholars, and it is colonialism and the advent of modernity that are held accountable for the lack of female religious authority in contemporary Muslim communities. The most telling example of this approach is the ambitious 40-volume biographical dictionary of Muslim women transmitters of hadith, muhaddithat, that has been undertaken by Dr. Muhammad Akram Nadwi in the UK. This project is not only textual. A quick search on YouTube will show multiple seminars and workshops that are held by Dr. Nadwi on this topic. The latest that came across my Facebook newsfeed was an advertisement for a muhaddithat retreat to southern Spain, where Dr. Nadwi, where participants will learn not only a kind of utopic history of Muslim Spain and Muslim rule of Spain, but also about Muslim women scholars who lived in that area during that time. Two other popular social media campaigns are the She Is Me campaign by Rabata, which is run by Tamara Gray, Ansa Tamara Gray, and the ongoing hashtag Forgotten Heroines. Both these campaigns highlight biographical details about Muslim women religious scholars, intellectuals, scientists, warriors, etc. in the past as a way of legitimizing Muslim women scholars and leaders today. Muslim women scholars in Islamic history have been a subject of scholarly study as well. Asma Saeed's study of women transmitters of hadith gives us a more nuanced historical account of women's religious authority. She argues that in early Islamic history, Muslim women were active in the transmission of knowledge. Perhaps the most prominent example is the Prophet's wife, Aisha, who took on a pivotal role both as a religious scholar, a teacher, and a political actor after his death. Her influence as a jurist, a hadith transmitter, and a muftiya has been acknowledged by many pre-modern legal scholars. Saeed argues, however, that as the enterprise of knowledge transmission became increasingly professionalized, women's role diminished, but was followed by a revival. This revival was largely due to the canonization of hadith, because of which authority and transmission switched from oral, so the oral transmission of prophetic traditions, to the written. So now you had the sort of canon of written hadith, which were then transmitted, so the authority shifted to the text, and that facilitated a greater role for women as scholars of hadith. Laurie Silvers has also talked about, given a similar narrative about Sufi women saints, this movement from a kind of more dynamic and informal kind of authority that gets increasingly diminished with professionalization. While there are historical studies of women as hadith transmitters, little work has been done on female jurists in Islamic history. Thus, my research project turns to biographical dictionaries from the medieval period to reconstruct the lives of female jurists. And for the purposes of this talk, I'll focus on just this one. While I'm focusing here on the life of one female jurist, she is by no means a historical anomaly. Although female legal scholars by no means dominated the intellectual circles, a brief survey of biographical dictionaries shows a large number of female jurists throughout the centuries. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, for example, mentions a female jurist by the name of Bint Taqiyuddin al-Wasiti, a contemporary of Fatima al-Baghdadiyya. Another, Ash-Shakhawi, the student of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, in his biographical collection then mentions the student Bint Taqiyuddin, who, so you can kind of see these generational legacies that are happening both between the students who are talking about these female jurists and were students of these female jurists. We also hear about women who built renowned madrasas that then became the location of jurisprudential study. We also have the esteemed example of the Hanafi jurist and muftiya Fatima as-Samarqandiya. She was famous for her knowledge and command of Hanafi fiqh and supposedly authored many texts that were widely used by other scholars. She was the daughter of Ala ad-Din as-Samarqandi, who's a well-known Hanafi legal jurist, and the wife of Abu Bakr ibn Mas'ud al-Kasani. She is reported to have authored many legal opinions, but in the name of her father and her husband. So let me begin by reading a brief entry about Fatima al-Baghdadiyya in the biographical dictionary of the well-known 14th century scholar Ibn Rajab. Ibn Rajab writes, Zainab, a preacher and an ascetic. She was a teacher, a jurist, a learned woman, a transmitter of prophetic narrations, a muftiya. She was fearful of God, humble, honorable, obedient, and modest. She was pious and righteous, blessed, virtuous, rigorous, and well-rounded in matters of knowledge. From Baghdad, she was excellent and masterful, one of a kind in her time, unique in her era. People would come to her from everywhere. Lofty in rank and abounding in knowledge, she was asked about intricate and particular matters. She mastered fiqh and a profound understanding of it. She studied with Shamsuddin ibn Abu Umar until she excelled. If she was ambiguous about a question, she would ask Ibn Taymiyyah, so she's a contemporary of Ibn Taymiyyah, and he would inform her about it. He was amazed by her and her intellect and was excessive in his praise of her. She was diligent, fasting during the day and praying through the night. She was a caretaker, speaker of truth, ascetic in her lifestyle, satisfied and content with little, commanding good and forbidding wrong. Many people benefited from her, and her status arose and her position ascended. It was said she passed 80 years of age. Fatima al-Baghdadiyya was born in Baghdad though her place and date of birth are not provided in any of the entries. At some point in her life, she moved to Damascus, where she studied fiqh with a group of prominent Hanbali jurists referred to as the Maqadisa. She is widely acknowledged in different biographical accounts as an accomplished jurist and a preacher, and is described as having a strong grasp of fiqh and command. So this example that I gave is sort of replicated in multiple biographical dictionaries. One of her teachers, Shamsuddin ibn Abu Umar, the most prominent jurist among the Maqadisa, had himself received transmission of prophetic narrations from a female teacher. So you can see these generational connections. Among his famous students was the well-known Taqi ad-Din ibn Taymiyyah, a contemporary of Fatima al-Baghdadiyya. Almost all the biographical entries make mention of Ibn Taymiyyah's tremendous respect for her and engagement with her, and compared her excellence in matters of law to him. In fact, she often met and engaged with Ibn Taymiyyah during her lifetime. Ibn Kathir, one of Ibn Taymiyyah's students, wrote about Fatima al-Baghdadiyya in his grand work of human history, Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya. He wrote not only that Ibn Taymiyyah was excessive in his praise of her intellect, but that whenever he heard that she would be present at one of his study circles, he would anxiously prepare for that session, as he knew that she would often outwit him in these exchanges. In the year 700 Hijri, or 1300 of the Common Era, several years before her death, she moved from Damascus to Cairo, where she began to teach at the Ribat al-Baghdadiyya. The Ribat was an endowed institution that was allotted specifically for housing women, particularly widows, divorcees, and women who were without permanent housing. As part of the life of the Ribat, women often engaged in study circles, and certain Ribats were so large that they had an appointed position for a female scholar for the benefits of the residents. The Ribat al-Baghdadiyya, where Fatima al-Baghdadiyya took on a teaching post, was in fact founded by a woman, part of the aristocratic family. Among her responsibilities, Fatima al-Baghdadiyya's responsibilities, were leading women in prayer and devotion and teaching them fiqh. Already a well-known preacher, she became famous at the Ribat as well, and she continued teaching there until the time of her death. Of the many different biographical entries that I collected on her, almost all had a similar brief sketch of her life. In one biographical entry, however, there's fleeting mention of an exchange between Fatima al-Baghdadiyya and a fellow jurist that struck me. The 14th century biographer As-Safadi writes, and I quote, it was narrated to me that she, Fatima al-Baghdadiyya, had an exchange with Sheikh Sadr al-Din ibn al-Wakil about menstruation. She convinced him of her position and then proclaimed, "Your knowledge of this matter is only theoretical. I know it theoretically and experientially." When I first came across this entry, I had to stop and sit with the power of that statement. This was not the first time that I had heard a Muslim woman critique the legal rulings regarding menstruation by calling upon her experiential and corporeal knowledge. I have found myself in many a conversation with fellow Muslim women lamenting on the impracticality of these legal rulings. Something about what the fiqh requires of our menstruating bodies feels so out of touch with our own bodily experiences. 2 years ago, as I prepared to labor and birth my daughter, I was again confronted by this sense of dissonance. I wanted to figure out how the obligation to pray the daily prayers was diminished for women in labor. I figured it was not possible that women in labor would be expected to pray, but I was wrong. As I looked up these legal rulings, I realized that the obligation to pray continued for a woman until the head of the baby crowned. I was simply taken aback. I looked up multiple sources and kept thinking to myself, there's absolutely no way they would require a woman to pray, even as she begins to push this life out of her womb. So I called my mother and my aunt, women who had given birth before, and asked them what they did. When I told my mother about these legal rulings, she responded, clearly annoyed, "Men came up with these laws. What do they know about giving birth?" For myself, my mother, and many other Muslim women I know, they follow their bodily instincts in negotiating menstruation laws. And here I was hearing a voice from the 14th century, a female jurist nonetheless, who shared our instinct, who was thinking through the experiences of a female body. And yet there were other things that I noticed as well in these biographical accounts of her life. This exchange is only mentioned in one of numerous biographical entries of her life. It is also quite literally a line mentioned in passing. We are provided with next to no details about this exchange. What were the specificities of this disagreement? How did they differ? What was her position on the issue? What were the implications of this exchange on menstruation law? We have absolutely no idea. As powerful as her voice is, it is also surrounded by incredible silences. It resounded for a brief moment, for an instant, we heard the voice of resistance from the past. The faintness of her presence is perhaps best understood if I contrast her to the men mentioned in relation to her. Both Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Rajab are well-known scholars in contemporary constructions of the Islamic tradition. Even as-Safadi is well known, so much so that he has his own biographical entry in the Brill Encyclopedia of Islam. As we all know, all we know of Fatima al-Baghdadiyya, however, is the skeletal sketches of her life. Even her accomplishments as a scholar are largely narrated in gender-specific language. She is praised for her exceptional intellect as a woman, her accomplishments praised as remarkable for a woman, and her sphere of influence is largely constrained to women. She is presented as preaching to women who benefited from her greatly. In fact, Ibn Taymiyyah, we are told, felt uncomfortable with Fatima al-Baghdadiyya's boldness in claiming her space. As Safadi mentions, that as part of her public life as a scholar and preacher, Fatima al-Baghdadiyya would climb the pulpit, the minbar, to preach. This bothered Ibn Taymiyyah, who eventually decided to raise this issue with her and stop her. However, he decided to deliberate on this decision overnight. And as he slept that night, he saw the Prophet in his dream. When he inquired about this matter, the Prophet attested to the piety of Fatima al-Baghdadiyya, saying, "She is a righteous woman," prompting Ibn Taymiyyah to back off. How then can we think about the legacy of these female jurists in Muslim history? As I mentioned earlier, the debate about the presence or absence of female scholars in Islamic history is often instrumentalized in multiple ways. For some, the argument of their absence serves as this linear narrative. Female jurists, it is argued, are an unprecedented move in Muslim history, occurring only now in the modern world. For others, arguing for the presence of female jurists in Muslim history serves as a legitimation for opening these doors to women in the present day. But their presence is also used by apologists for justifying the patriarchy of the Muslim past. The Muslim past is imagined as a world where Muslim women scholars participated equally with men and without constraint. The feminist critiques then of Muslim women today are delegitimized by calling upon the presence of these female scholars of the past. The involvement of pre-modern female jurists in the intellectual and scholarly circles is a complex and complicated history. Any effort to make these women visible must also account for the constraints within which they lived and functioned. By virtue of their existence in scholarly circles, these women engaged the system and were actively involved in its structuring. However, it is not clear the extent to which they contributed to shaped the legal discourse. Their mark on the development of Islamic law is largely untraceable. To date, published pre-modern legal literature does not include the work of any female jurist. While biographical entries indicate that some female jurists issued legal opinions, they often did so in the name of their male kin, making it near impossible to distinguish their legal opinions from those of their scholarly male relatives. The legacy of female jurists then must remain one of possibilities. One dimension is the possibility of loss, the loss of their scholarship, the loss of what Islamic law could have been but is not. But their legacy also opens up possibilities for the present and the future. And it is their legacy that Muslim women scholars and activists continue today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these three fascinating presentations. I will delay my own questions. We have approximately little less than 30 minutes, and I'm sure many of you have lots of questions. So please identify yourself and
Alaikum salam.
I'll hold it like that. Let me just talk really loudly. I never heard that the legal system in Islam was a post-colonial idea. I always thought that it always existed, and that because especially I feel in Islam law is so imbued sometimes, it's even imbued in marriage and things like that. So can you talk more about how the legal system is a post-colonial idea? So and before colonialism, how are things like marriage and justice, criminal justice and things like that, how are those legislated by communities?
Should we answer each
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
Okay. I'll try to make this brief because actually the short footnote is taken from a volume by Shadab Ahmed called What is Islam? It's 600 pages. It was my reading last week. So obviously I've reduced quite a bit. So I don't want to pretend I'm going to give you all of it right here. But what I mean is the characterization of Islam with a primary focus on its legal construction is a modern, invention. Islam always, prioritized the law, and the 300-year movement of, solidifying the schools of law emphasized that things like marriage and all that were clearly going to be adjudicated on terms that had some jurisprudential comprehension to them. They, it wasn't just how you feel, it was, what was proper in the law. So I don't want you to misunderstand this as saying that we didn't have the law, or that the law wasn't prominent, or that it wasn't a significant feature in the development of Islamic's internal discourses about itself. But the shaping of Islam as just law, as opposed to Islam as both theology and law, or spirituality and ethics, or politics even, the shaping of Islam as a legal system predominantly is a particularly modern discourse. So it is not the law itself, but it's the understanding of Islam through the lenses of its own historical legal articulation, which is quite elaborate, quite detailed, and always has been. So yes, we we adjudicated law on the basis of our understandings, both from customary and Islamic jurisprudential understanding, and that has always been a strong feature. But Islam is more than just its legal understanding of itself. And to prioritize the legal understanding, according to Shadab, is a modern, sort of post-colonial understanding.
Thank you.
Yes, Lisa?
Hi, I'm Megha Al-Hassan. This is a nerdy historian's question, Sadia. How do you make a medieval figure come to life like you did? How did you get some of the adjectives that hooked us in?
Oh, thank you for that question. So some of it was just this kind of, archival historian work of, finding information in these biographical dictionaries and then following particular figures and finding more information. But a lot of it actually took multiple drafts for me to feel comfortable taking creative license. And so this work I started doing actually for my master's back in 2007. And that was my master's thesis was on this. And when I went back to my thesis as I was developing this talk, I saw how constrained my translation of the entries was because I was so concerned with keeping it close to the text. And then at some point I realized that, these biographical dictionaries are not just collections of historical information, they were also literature in a way, right? So the entry that I read to you sounds very they were taking their own licenses. And so then I was like, well, I don't see why I can't take that sort of license. And so I took it and tried to kind of construct her life. And I'm glad to hear that it spoke in the ways that I was hoping it would. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bedriya. Thank you so much. So this is a question for all of you. And so I come from more of a Muslim context, but personally feel like I lean towards the secular side. So I was wondering, in a context where Islamic jurisprudence kind of rules family law, which I feel in my context at least disproportionately affected women in that way with family law, personal law, divorce law, and things like that. I was wondering if you could speak to your experiences on bridging the gap between the two types of people you encountered in terms of the secular and the non-secular, and kind of how you bridge the gap in understanding and for women to come together and move together to kind of change the system if, this jurisprudence or stuff has been often modified and adapted to fit official notions of social policy or local condition or anything like that, just in your lived experiences.
So a really small question, right? It's not complicated at all. I'll give you the answer in 30 seconds. One of the things, I'm not going to give you the answer in 30 seconds because there isn't a very good answer. But I think one of the really crucial strategies for Muslim women looking to have conversations about state laws, which sometimes opens up particular space for conversations with secular feminists, is to think about the range of ways in which governments keen to present their version of Islamic law as Islamic differ, so that Saudi law about X is different than Kuwaiti law about X, is different than Pakistani law, is different than Moroccan law, is different than Indian Muslim personal law, is different than what's being debated in South Africa as potential Muslim personal law. And I think that is different than Iranian law, right? Just an acknowledgement that the particulars of marriage contracts, right? A whole range of things that have been implemented as being religiously legitimate. And so that gives a range of potential things, I think, to choose from strategically. Now, the question of, and this was something I was going to ask you last night and push you on a little bit, and I didn't quite get there. So maybe you have some thoughts about this. You've raised it a little bit in the context of Beijing to the founding of Musawa, that period of almost 15 years. Is there a way in which operating strategically using the language of religion to attempt to gain certain kinds of options or reforms in national laws may close off certain kinds of secular possibilities, right? Does it constrain other women? Does it delegitimize secular feminism in a particular way? Does it narrow the range of options? I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, but certainly it's something that I think has to be taken into account.
Wow, she answered a question with a question. I'm going to have to
It's
ignore.
high-level technique.
I'm going to have to ignore that question for a minute because I want to say something in a very pragmatic way to your question. First of all, is to recommend you to look at the Musawa website, www.musawa.org. And the reason is because even though, and inadvertently I think I can answer your question this way, even though in 1995, it was the differences between us that was most stark, especially since literally I was, amongst women who had no place in these two dominant discourses. Since that time, to the present, we're very clear that change and reform and benefits in the lives of Muslim women has come from all corners. We don't have to demarcate a separation from either Islamist or secular Muslim feminists because strategically it's not in our interest. Our interest is actually to be comprehensive. So we do have to understand the rubric of the divide in terms of its ability to disallow us to be able to combine our efforts in order to achieve certain goals. But we have to strategize in order to form the alliances for the benefit of the constituency above and beyond what might be our ideological separations. So I take, for example, the model of the global campaign against violence against women. It was not denominated by race or class. It was not denominated by religion. It was not denominated by language group, North or South, because women experience violence everywhere. And so therefore strategies need to be galvanized from every resource. So that's how we feel today with regard to it. But at a most practical level, as I said, there is a three-pronged approach to how we address any particular issue. That is a reconstruction of knowledge in Islam, that is production of new knowledge, feminist critique and analysis, the Constitution in any particular nation state. Most nation states have one. Obviously, Saudi Arabia does not yet. We're working on that. And the international instruments. And at any one time, in terms of any one issue, those three components will be configured with different points of emphasis based on the realities on the ground. That's the beauty of it. So in other words, what prevents women from experiencing their full equality in one context may not just be how the law is codified on the books in personal status law. It may also be a kind of cultural milieu that resist the possibility of talking about equality altogether. So we have to have a different kind of nuanced strategy of how to approach that. And our approach is always to indicate, exactly what we have already seen demonstrated here, that Islam is a construct. It has been constructed over time by a number of actors for a number of different reasons. And we usually peel back the layers and allow people to see that. So the conversations between secularism, for example, and Islam are not new. They're shaped very differently in the post-colonial era, but there's always been an understanding of a certain purview of the law that is limited to matters of state that doesn't really have a, guidance in the Quran or from the Hadith or from the Prophet's Sunnah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we have to demonstrate this to actors on the ground because of the, as I said, the number one method that is used to be able to shut women down is to say you can't do that, it's against Islam. We have to problematize this notion of a static Islam that sits out there that is allowed to place restrictions on the motions that they do on the ground, utilizing secular, international, constitutional, and Islamic means in order to be able to achieve their goals. So as a consequence, there is no marginalization of women whose choices not to engage with religion. In fact, we have increased over the last 3 or 4 years. We have increased participation by secular women who say, I don't believe in this myself, but my constituency has a certain alliance to this, and in order to be effective in addressing, their needs, I need to have this language. So it's a very practical thing, working with actual policy reform, which I would contend is very different from working with jurisprudence, because that's, sort of theoretical and analytical, but working with actual reform really grounds you in how to be able to strategize towards, the benefits of equality and justice across the board.
I would say the one thing that struck me in your talk was this moment where you said something, I'm just paraphrasing, about realizing that all human knowledge is a construct. And I think oftentimes it seems to me that these sort of debates that end up happening between secular feminists and religious feminists, this sort of attitude that religion is necessarily patriarchal, and so then any claim of gender equality and gender justice from within a religious framework is necessarily sort of giving into patriarchy, or is a false consciousness, or this idea that secularism is some kind of evil that must be avoided, right? I mean, it seems to me like all of these oppositions to these ideas develop because we fail to understand how all of these are constructs, and so if secular-minded feminists can understand that their conception of freedom and equality is constructed in a way differently than what women who are coming from within a religious framework might be arguing for. And on the opposite end, women who are speaking from within a religious context can also understand how secularism has, offered possibilities for them to start to ask certain kinds of questions. Then I think there's a possibility for engagement while realizing that we're not necessarily going to agree with one another, right? But I think that
And we don't have to.
And we don't have to. But there's a kind of shared vision of a world where women don't have to suffer because they're women, even though we might not agree on what that world looks like, or what suffering means and how a post-suffering world would look like. But the fact that there is that vision that is shared, I think if we can highlight that and move from there, then we can undo these kinds of binaries. But oftentimes I feel like we're still in the space where we end up in these debates of, is this true liberation, is this true agency, or then the opposite of undercutting secular feminism as not being legitimate because it's Western, modern, so on and so forth. So that's kind of one of the ways that I've tried to think about it, is how to center that vision while also keeping alive the pluralism that is necessary.
I actually had a sort of comment question and kind of push a little bit on what's happening with you guys talking right now. So I was thinking about, you mentioned violence against women. And so in the United States, right, we talk about, we had the violence against women in law, right? But it was this sort of production of like carceral feminism, right? Because what ends up happening is that, so we're going to protect women, but the sort of primary sort of victims of the protection of women ended up being Black and brown men, right? This is the ways in which the laws work here, right? Like, lock people up, right? And it wasn't, so this became the sort of outset of that. So my question is like, and so I guess I'm asking this question because even what you just said, like we all agree we should suffer, but if we don't agree what suffering is, and we don't agree, what that world looks like, I'm just wondering, like, how is it that you sort of, how is it that you connect, sort of find that space of connection, but also be really aware, right, of the differences and like power in those relationships, and what are the consequences of connecting, right? Because this is, so violence against women sounded like a good thing, but when it passed in Congress and the results of that were really negative for communities of color, including the women in those communities. So I guess that was just kind of a question.
One of the things that comes to mind immediately, and it's a really good question, is thinking about what it means to work across difference. I know you know this, right? But sometimes if you agree on a sort of minimum desirable outcome, right? The lowest common denominator, we don't want violence against women, right? But then that question about what does the desired outcome look like and how is it going to affect everyone, right? So we agree that we don't want violence against women. What does that mean for you in your community? What's going to be the helpful thing, right? In my community, this might be what I go to, right? You pass a law, you put dollars behind its enforcement, you do all of this. And then if I'm actually in a room having a conversation with someone who says to me, yeah, that's really not a good idea because this is what's going to happen, I think that goes to your point about, how Musawa works in communities, that you're letting different communities set the agenda. That can only happen when you have coalitions and solidarity across that difference as opposed to a shared agenda being determined from the top.
You want to respond?
So, thank you for raising that question, because I think one of my discomforts with the way in which the Me Too campaign has developed is this kind of, culture of mass. We live in a culture, and a system of oppression where we know the people that are going to suffer the most are not men as some kind of category, but particular kinds of men. And the conversations around the Me Too campaign doesn't want to pick up that conversation, right? It wants to frame the conversation in a way as though there are women in the world who are harmed by men. I think the way that what my hope is that we can be in a world where we can actually then hear one another. So for me, the fact that there are people who have written those kinds of critiques of the Me Too campaign is important. The question now is how to get people who wouldn't necessarily hear it to be in, how to get them to kind of be in conversation. Because it seems to me like, particularly in the context of the US, we're at this moment where there are just these ideological camps that everybody sort of shouts across. And everybody writes each other off because you're either this or that, right? You're a progressive and you're a liberal and you're a right wing and so on and so forth. So I think for me, my comment was not about imagining a utopic world where we kind of imagine the sort of post-racial utopic world and ignore the realities on the ground. But part of what I've been troubled by is thinking about how do we have those conversations across our very important commitments and to be able to communicate with one another, because that's what I feel like is not happening, right? Certain kinds of critiques are just written off as like, well, yeah, those lefties would say things like that.
So my approach to it is slightly different, and that is that it's sort of a systems analysis approach, and that is that the global violence, anti-violence against women campaign has manifestations in different locations differently. And I would urge you to re-examine the automatic conclusion that therefore the consequence of it is disproportionately aggressive against brown and black male bodies, because actually the results of this kind of interrogation of black male bodies is the police state. It's not the issue of violence against women. And so the consequence of any mechanism that relies upon the implementation of the police in a police state is going to use that as an excuse to be able to continue the campaign against black and brown male bodies in the first place. But if you misalign it with the violence against women campaign, as if that is the reason why that happens, then you create exactly the missed opportunity for conversation between the reality of intersectional oppressions. So if you step back and you look at what is the cause of the actual increased level of policing of black and brown male bodies, it's not violence against women and campaigns. It is the police state.
No, I know that. So I was saying that in the U.S., what happened with the law, that's what happened, right? So the campaign was called this.
Yeah, but I mean, in the police state, any excuse that they have to justify their violence against certain bodies is going to be used, even if the excuse is actually globally a really powerful campaign. So that's just what happens. The notion, for example, that the opportunity for women to live and justice, honor, equality, and dignity is necessarily a campaign against men, that really needs to be nipped in the bud. In fact, to allow for the equality and justice of all human beings means that we are going to have to look really directly at the extent to which we have articulated that at an abstract level, basing it upon white male bodies altogether, and therefore it isn't manifest in a form that is actual equality and honor and dignity for all bodies. It's just a problem, and we allow ourselves to get hoodwinked into freeze-stopping the conversation at the point at which we we realize that pluralism is very complicated, it's very messy. It does not have a singular outcome. Nevertheless, it is the only reality that we will be able to survive with on this planet. So we just have to engage it a little bit more strategically, I think.
We are going to do two last questions, the two Mayas, and then I know there might be other burning questions. Our guests are here for the rest of the day, so in coffee breaks, lunch break, whatever you can ask.
I think this is more a comment, but just to follow on Suad's point, I think the flip side of that then is that questions like incarceration become feminist issues, right? Because so it's not just violence against women that's a feminist issue, but also the question of black male incarceration, precisely for the reasons that you're getting at. That's what she's saying.
Well, thank you. Sorry for indulging me again. But this is off of these comments. I have a question. Professor Wadud, yesterday you kind of threw in terms around anarchism, and today you mentioned the emergence of the nation state and having to work within this framework. I'm interested in what place abolitionism has in, like, that bridge we keep on talking about right now, secularism and Islamic feminism. Like, where does abolition fit in this moment? And I don't know if you identify as an anarchist or as having anarchist ideals, but I also wonder if you could say more about some of that within...
I have no idea what is abolition
Prison-
after the...
Prison abolition.
Prison abolition.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Mhm.
Sorry, I mean, in some of these activist spaces, we just refer to it as abolitionism.
Okay. Okay, so I'm not really sure still what the question is. I mean, I can say something about the abolition of the prison industrial complex, just based on, you know, listening to Angela Davis and what's the older Asian American woman who recently passed away? She was like 90.
Yuri Kochiyama?
Yes. And that is that our capacity to be able to radically think about the ways in which we reform behaviors in societies, unfortunately, has been defaulted to this kind of, you know, heinous, you know, sort of prison industrial complex. But there are other ways in which we can engage with behavior modification, including non-coercive ones, and also because the main way that we have to start is actually with the way in which we raise children and our idea about, you know, how we nurture ethics and humanity as we go through the full process. So when we don't do that, and the end result is then you penalize people by putting them into these, you know, complexes. It shows the absence of a really comprehensive trajectory about what we call, you know, the good humanity, you know. So I don't have a lot of experience with regard to the nuts and bolts about how it is developed. I just kind of listen in awe in terms of the fact that the prison system does not achieve the goals that it's supposed to fulfill anyway, so it's a failed system, and its perpetuation and its reduction to the private sector, I mean, people actually literally privately owning prisons, means we're entering into a bigger and bigger pit of hell. So I'm really in favor of the movements for the abolitionists, which require radically rethinking about, you know, what we do in terms of the law and what we consider to be the breaking of the law. But I don't have any experience with it, and I literally don't have a link between the work that I'm doing in terms of Muslim personal status law, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this first panel. Before I ask you to join me in thanking our guests, I want to remind you that you have barely 2 minutes to stand up and stretch your hands, replenish tea, coffee.